The congregation of 3,000 at Divine Mercy Cathedral in Warri, Delta State, stood frozen as the woman in the torn, faded wrapper and headscarf walked slowly down the center aisle during Sunday morning praise and worship, her bare feet making no sound on the red carpet, her skin ash-gray from malnutrition, her eyes sunken but burning with something that made grown men step back as she passed, and Pastor Joshua Emeka, standing at the altar with his microphone mid-song, his new wife Sister Blessing. Beside him in her designer asoebi, went completely pale because the woman walking toward him, the woman the entire church had mourned 3 years ago, the woman whose funeral he had presided over with tears streaming down his face as he clutched her empty casket, the woman he had buried in the cemetery behind the church with a headstone that read Patience Emeka, beloved wife, gone too soon, was standing right there alive, walking toward him like something risen from the grave, and the look in her eyes said she had not come for reconciliation, she had come for revelation, and Pastor Joshua knew in that moment that everything he had built, every lie he had carefully constructed, every comfortable day he had enjoyed with his new wife in the mansion Patience's inheritance had bought, was about to crumble into dust. Where are you watching from? Lagos, Abuja, maybe Port Harcourt or London. Drop it in the comments because this story will shake you to your core. And I need to know where in the world people still believe that truth buried always finds a way to dig itself out. 5 years before that Sunday morning, when a dead woman walked back into her own funeral church, Patience Oakley was a 28-year-old schoolteacher at Community Primary School in Warri, living a simple, decent life in a 2-bedroom flat. Her late father, a retired customs officer, had left her, and she was beautiful in that quiet, dignified way, medium height, dark skin that glowed with health. Natural hair she wore in neat cornrows, always dressed modestly, always smiling, the kind of woman parents pointed to and told their daughters to emulate, and she had been raised by her father after her mother died when Patience was 7, raised to be independent, educated, to save money, to never depend completely on any man, and her father had left her not just the flat, but also a piece of land in their village, Akpra in Delta State, and some savings, about 8 million naira total. Enough to live comfortably if she was careful, and Patience was always careful, always responsible, always planning for the future. She met Joshua Emeka at a teachers' conference in Lagos where he was the guest speaker. Not yet a senior pastor, just an assistant pastor at a small Pentecostal church in Warri. But he had that presence, that charisma that made people lean forward when he spoke, made them believe that God was speaking directly through him. And he was handsome too, tall and well-built with a deep voice and intense eyes. And when he approached Patience during the networking session, complimented her questions. During the Q&A, asked for her number so they could discuss ministry and education. Patience felt something she hadn't felt before, a pull, a sense that maybe this was God's plan for her life. They dated for 9 months, and Joshua was everything Patience had prayed for in a husband, attentive without being controlling, spiritual without being self-righteous, ambitious but seemingly humble. He talked about building a ministry that would transform lives, about starting schools for poor children, about using whatever God blessed him with to bless others, and Patience, who had always wanted to do more than just teach in one classroom, who dreamed of impacting her community on a larger scale, thought she had found a true partner, someone who shared her values, her vision, her faith. They got married in a beautiful but modest ceremony at his church. Nothing extravagant, because Patience didn't believe in wasting money on one day when that money could build a future, and Joshua had agreed enthusiastically, had praised her wisdom and maturity, had told her she was different from other women who only cared about showing off, and Patience felt seen, felt valued, felt blessed. The first year of marriage was good. Joshua was loving and supportive. They lived in Patience's flat because it was bigger than his one-room apartment. He continued his work as assistant pastor while Patience taught at her school. They saved money together, planned together, prayed together, and Patience felt grateful every day for her husband, for the life they were building. Then Joshua's senior pastor died suddenly of a heart attack, and the church board, after much prayer and deliberation, appointed Joshua as the new senior pastor of Redeemed Pentecostal Assembly. It was a small church, maybe 200 members, in a rented hall in Warri. But Joshua saw it as his moment, his calling, his opportunity to build the ministry he had always dreamed of, and Patience supported him completely. She quit her teaching job when he asked, so she could focus on being a pastor's wife, supporting his ministry full-time, and she threw herself into the work, leading the women's fellowship, organizing outreach programs, counseling young women, doing everything she could to help her husband's ministry grow. The church grew quickly under Joshua's leadership. His preaching was powerful, and his vision was compelling. Within 18 months, they had grown from 200 to 800 members, and Joshua started talking about building their own church facility, about needing land, about this being the season for expansion. And Patience had that land in the village, the one her father had left her, 5 plots in a good location. And when Joshua suggested they donate it to the church, use it as seed faith for God to multiply their ministry, Patience hesitated because her father had specifically told her before he died to never sell that land, that it was her security, her inheritance, something no husband or hardship could take from her. But Joshua was persuasive. He prayed with her for hours, showed her scriptures about not putting material things above God's work, reminded her that they were building God's kingdom, not their own empire. And he cried real tears as he told her about the vision God had given him of thousands of souls being saved in a church built on that very land. And Patience, who loved her husband and trusted him completely, who believed his tears were genuine and his vision was from God, signed the land over to the church, signed papers that made Joshua the sole trustee of the church property. And within 6 months Joshua had secured a loan using the land as collateral, had started construction on a massive church building that could seat 3,000 people. And Patience was excited, watching her father's land transform into a house of God, believing she had made the right choice, believing God would honor their sacrifice. But as the church grew and the building rose from the ground, Joshua changed. He became obsessed with image and status. He started wearing expensive suits and driving a new SUV that the church board had blessed him with. He started traveling for conferences and crusades, sometimes gone for weeks, and when he was home he was distant, always on his phone, always in meetings, barely spending time with Patience. And when she tried to talk to him about feeling neglected, about wanting to start a family now that the church was established, Joshua would get irritated, would tell her she was being selfish, that she didn't understand the pressure of ministry, that she needed to be more supportive and less demanding, and Patience would apologize, would try harder to be understanding, would push down the growing unease in her spirit that something was wrong, that the man she married was disappearing behind the persona of Pastor Joshua Emeka. Then Patience discovered she was pregnant. After 3 years of marriage, she was finally carrying the child they had both prayed for, and she was overjoyed. She told Joshua one evening after service, expecting him to be thrilled, but his face had gone cold, and he said, "Are you sure this is the right timing?" And Patience's heart sank, because what kind of father says that about his first child? And Joshua explained that he was about to launch a new branch of the church in Sapeel, that he needed to focus on expansion, that a baby would distract them both, and he suggested very carefully that maybe they should wait on God's timing, which Patience understood to mean he wanted her to terminate the pregnancy, and she refused. She told him firmly that this baby was a blessing, that she would never consider such a thing, and Joshua's face had darkened with an anger she had never seen before, and he said, "Fine, but don't expect me to slow down my ministry for your pregnancy." And, from that moment, everything changed between them. Joshua became cruel in ways that were calculated and systematic. He stopped giving Patience money for upkeep, claiming the church finances were tight, even though she could see him spending lavishly on himself. He stopped coming home most nights, claiming he was staying at the church to pray and prepare sermons. He started criticizing everything about her, her cooking, her appearance, her spiritual maturity. And he did it publicly. During church services he would make comments about wives who don't support their husband's vision, about women who use pregnancy as an excuse to be lazy, and the congregation would laugh, not knowing he was talking about his own wife. And Patience endured it all, believing that once the baby came, once Joshua held his child, his heart would soften, his love would return. But the baby never came. When Patience was 6 months pregnant, she went into premature labor after Joshua pushed her during an argument, pushed her so hard she fell against the dining table, and she was rushed to the hospital by a neighbor who heard her screaming. And the baby, a boy, was born too early, too small, and he lived for only 3 hours before his tiny lungs gave up. And Patience held her son's body and wept with a grief so deep it felt like her own soul was dying. And Joshua came to the hospital eventually, hours after the baby died, and he showed no emotion, no tears, no comfort. He just said God knows best, and left to go preach at an evening service. And Patience realized with devastating clarity that her husband felt nothing, that whatever he once was or pretended to be was gone, and what remained was a monster wearing a pastor's collar. Patience fell into a depression after losing her baby. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop crying, and Joshua showed no patience, no compassion. He told her she was being dramatic, that she needed to get over it and focus on supporting his ministry. And when Patience said she needed time to grieve, needed professional help, maybe counseling, Joshua refused, said that seeking therapy meant she didn't trust God, that her depression was a sign of weak faith, and he started telling church members that his wife was going through spiritual warfare, that they should pray for her deliverance, and Patience became isolated, cut off from the few friends she had because Joshua convinced them she was unstable, dangerous even, and Patience was trapped, living in what was now Joshua's house because he had used her flat as collateral for another church loan. Then Joshua introduced the church to Sister Blessing Okoye, the new choir director, a beautiful light-skinned woman of 25 with a voice like an angel and a body that made men turn their heads, and she was talented, charismatic, always dressed in tight-fitting clothes that seemed inappropriate for church, but nobody said anything because Pastor Joshua had personally hired her, personally praised her anointing, personally spent hours in rehearsals with her while Patience sat alone at home, and Patience knew, she knew with a wife's intuition that her husband was sleeping with this woman. She could see it in the way Blessing looked at Joshua, the way she touched his arm during conversations, the way she smiled at Patience with barely concealed contempt. And when Patience confronted Joshua, showed him the text messages she had found on his phone, messages that were clearly romantic, clearly sexual, Joshua didn't deny it. Instead, he slapped Patience so hard she fell to the ground, and he told her she was crazy, that she was a jealous, bitter woman who was trying to destroy his ministry with false accusations, and he told her that if she ever mentioned this again, if she ever tried to disgrace him publicly, she would regret it, and Patience believed him because the man standing over her with rage in his eyes was capable of anything. 3 months later, Joshua came home with a plan that he presented to Patience like it was a generous solution. He said she needed to go to the village, to their family land in Okpra, to rest and recover from her mental breakdown. He said the quiet environment would be good for her, that she could stay in the old family house that was on the property, that she could heal there away from the stress of ministry life. And Patience didn't want to go. Something in his tone frightened her, but Joshua insisted, said he had already arranged everything. And the next day he drove her himself to Okpra, a remote village 3 hours from Wari, down roads that got narrower and more isolated the further they went. And when they arrived at the old house, a small 2-room structure that Patience's grandfather had built decades ago, surrounded by thick bush with no close neighbors, Joshua helped her inside with her bags, and then he left, promising to visit in a few days, and Patience stood in the dusty house feeling deeply uneasy, but telling herself she was being paranoid, that her husband was just trying to help her recover. Joshua never came back to visit. Instead, 3 days after dropping Patience in the village, he paid 2 men, local touts from Okpra who would do anything for money, to go to the house at night, to lock all the doors and windows from the outside with padlocks and chains, and to board up any openings. And these men did exactly that while Patience slept. And when she woke the next morning and tried to open the door to fetch water from the well outside, she found it locked, chained, impossible to open, and she ran to the windows but they were all boarded up, and she screamed for help but the house was too isolated, too far from any neighbors, and nobody came, nobody heard, and Patience realized with horror that she was trapped, that her husband had imprisoned her, and she pounded on the door until her hands bled, screamed until her voice was hoarse. But there was only silence, only the sound of birds in the bush, only the terrible understanding that Joshua intended to leave her here too. The 2 men Joshua had paid came once a week, always at night, and they would push food through a small gap at the bottom of the door, bread and gari and sometimes a tin of sardines, barely enough to survive on, and they would leave a jerrycan of water, and Patience would beg them to let her out, would promise them money, would cry and plead, but they ignored her. They had been paid well, and warned by Pastor Joshua that the woman inside was mentally ill, dangerous, that they were helping to keep her safe until she recovered. And they believed him because he was a man of God, because pastors don't lie, because they wanted the money more than they wanted the truth. Back in Wari, 2 weeks after locking Patience in the village house, Joshua stood before his congregation of 1,500 members, now meeting in their new church building, and he made an announcement that shocked everyone. He said with tears streaming down his face that he had terrible news, that his wife, Sister Patience, had been in a car accident while traveling to visit a sick relative, that she had died on impact, that her body had been badly burned in the fire that followed the crash, and the Congregation gasped and wept, and Joshua collapsed at the altar in apparent grief, and the church members rushed to comfort him, to pray over him, to tell him God would give him strength to endure this tragedy, and nobody questioned it. Nobody asked to see a body or a police report. Nobody thought to investigate because Pastor Joshua was a man of God, and men of God don't lie about their wives dying. Joshua organized a funeral 2 weeks later, a big elaborate funeral at Divine Mercy Cathedral, which was what the church was now called, and there was a casket, a beautiful white casket with gold handles, and it was closed because Joshua explained that Patience's body had been too badly burned to be viewed, and 2,000 people attended the funeral. They filled the church and spilled into the overflow area, and they wept as Joshua delivered a eulogy about his beloved wife, about her dedication to ministry, about how much he would miss her, about how God had taken her home, and he cried such convincing tears that even people who had seen him mistreat Patience believed his grief was genuine, and they buried the empty casket in the cemetery behind the church with a beautiful granite headstone that cost 300,000 naira, and Joshua played the grieving widower perfectly. 6 months after the funeral, Joshua married Sister Blessing in a lavish wedding ceremony that cost over 15 million naira, and some church members whispered that it was too soon, that a man should mourn his wife for at least a year before remarrying. But Joshua addressed these concerns from the pulpit. He said that God had spoken to him, had told him that Blessing was his Ruth, his second chance at happiness, that remaining alone would hinder his ministry, and he quoted scriptures about how it's not good for man to be alone. And he cried again as he talked about how Patience would have wanted him to be happy, would have wanted him to move on, and the congregation, moved by his tears and his apparent sincerity, accepted the marriage, celebrated it even, and Sister Blessing became the new First Lady of Divine Mercy Cathedral, and she moved into the mansion that Patience's inheritance had built, slept in the bed Patience had slept in, wore jewelry that Patience had owned, and she did it all with a smile that said she had won. Meanwhile, in the village house in Akbra, Patience was dying slowly. She had lost so much weight that her ribs showed through her skin. Her hair was falling out from malnutrition. Her skin was covered in sores from the filth she lived in because there was no bathroom, just a bucket in the corner that she had to use, and the smell was unbearable, and she was weak, so weak that some days she couldn't even stand, and she prayed constantly, begged God to either let her die quickly or send someone to rescue her, and the days blurred into weeks and the weeks into months, and she lost track of time, lost track of everything except the endless cycle of hunger and thirst and despair. But Patience didn't die. Something in her refused to die. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the memory of her father telling her she was strong like her grandmother. Maybe it was pure spite, the determination that Joshua would not win, would not erase her from existence without consequence. And she started rationing her food more carefully, started exercising in the small space to keep her muscles from wasting away completely, started planning, thinking, waiting for an opportunity. The opportunity came during the rainy season, 2.5 years into her imprisonment, when the heavy rains softened the mud walls of the old house, and Patience noticed that one section of the wall near the back window was crumbling, and she started working on it with her bare hands, digging at the mud with a broken piece of wood she had found, digging every day for weeks, her fingers bleeding and infected, but she kept digging, kept working, because this was her only chance, and finally, after 6 weeks of digging, she created a hole big enough to squeeze through. And one night when the moon was dark and the 2 men who brought her food were not due for another 3 days, Patience pushed herself through that hole, felt the wooden boards scrape her skin, felt her malnourished body barely fit through the gap. But she made it. She fell into the wet grass outside, breathed fresh air for the first time in over 2 years, and she wanted to cry but she had no tears left, so she just started walking. Patience walked through the night, barefoot through the bush, wearing only the torn wrapper that was all that remained of her clothes, and she avoided the main road because she didn't know who Joshua had paid, who might recognize her and drag her back, so she walked through farms and forest, and when dawn came she hid, and when night fell she walked again, and she had no food and no water except what she could find in streams, and it took her 4 days to walk the distance that should have taken 3 hours by car, 4 days of hiding and walking and nearly dying. But finally she reached the outskirts of Wari, and she saw the city she had once called home, and she knew exactly where she needed to go. Patience spent 2 weeks hiding in an abandoned building near the market, watching, planning, gathering information from market women who gossiped freely. And that's how she learned about her own funeral, about Joshua's remarriage, about how Divine Mercy Cathedral had grown to 3,000 members, about how Pastor Joshua and his beautiful new wife were the most admired couple in Warri, about how they lived in a mansion and drove expensive cars and were living the life Patience had helped build. And the rage that filled her was cold and focused, not the hot rage that makes people careless, but the calculating rage that makes people dangerous. She learned that Sunday service started at 9 a.m., that it was always packed, that it was live-streamed to thousands online, that Joshua loved his dramatic moments at the altar, and Patience realized that if she was going to expose him, if she was going to make sure the truth was heard, she needed to do it publicly, dramatically, in a way that couldn't be silenced or denied. And what better place than Sunday service? What better moment than when Joshua was at the height of his performance? What better witness than 3,000 congregation members and thousands more online? Patience prepared carefully. She stole clothes from a charity donation box, found a wrapper and headscarf. She ate food from the market trash bins to gain a little strength. She practiced walking without collapsing. And she waited for Sunday. And when Sunday morning came, she walked the 3 kilometers from her hiding place to Divine Mercy Cathedral, and she arrived just as praise and worship was reaching its peak, just as the congregation was standing with hands raised, just as Joshua was on the altar singing with his new wife beside him, and Patience walked through the main doors that she had helped choose when the church was being built, walked past the ushers who tried to stop her thinking she was a mad woman. Patience kept walking, her eyes fixed on Joshua, and the ushers fell back because something in her gaze made them afraid, made them sense that this was not a random mad woman but something else, something that had crawled out of death itself. And as she walked down the aisle, the congregation began to notice, began to turn and stare, and the singing faltered and died, and a woman in the 3rd row screamed because she recognized the face, the walk, the way Patience held her head even though the body was skeletal and the clothes were rags, and the woman screamed, "Sister Patience, Sister Patience, oh my God, it's Sister Patience." And the scream rippled through the church like an electric shock, and people started shouting and crying, and some ran for the exits thinking they were seeing a ghost. And Joshua stood frozen at the altar, his microphone hanging loose in his hand, his face drained of all color. And Sister Blessing beside him looked confused, looked at Joshua for explanation, and saw only terror in his eyes. Patience reached the altar, climbed the 3 steps slowly because her legs were weak, but her will was iron, and she stood face to face with Joshua. And the church had gone completely silent now, 3,000 people holding their breath, watching this impossible moment, and Patience took the microphone from Joshua's limp hand. And when she spoke, her voice was hoarse and cracked, but it carried through the sound system to every corner of the church and to every device streaming the service online. And she said, "My name is Patience Emeka. I am the wife this man buried 3 years ago. I am the woman whose funeral you attended, whose grave is in the cemetery behind this church. And I am not dead. I was never dead. I was locked in a house in Akpra village for 2.5 years, left to die slowly, while my husband married his mistress and took over the life I built." The congregation erupted, people screaming questions, security rushing toward the altar, but Patience kept talking, her voice getting stronger with every word, and she said, "This church was built on land my father left me. This mansion you see your pastor living in was bought with my inheritance money. Everything he has, everything he is, was built on what he stole from me after he locked me away to die. And when I wouldn't die fast enough, he staged my death, buried an empty casket, and married the woman he was sleeping with while I was grieving our dead baby. The baby that died because he pushed me in anger, because he never wanted a child, only wanted my money and my land." Joshua tried to grab the microphone back, but several men in the congregation, men who had known Patience before, rushed to the altar and blocked him. And one of them, Brother Emeka, who had been a deacon, said, "Let her speak, Pastor. Let her speak or we will make you speak." And Joshua backed away, his face switching between rage and panic. And Sister Blessing was crying now, saying, "Joshua, what is she talking about? Who is this woman?" And Joshua couldn't answer, couldn't form words because 3 years of carefully constructed lies were collapsing in real time. Patience continued, "I have been in hell for 2.5 years, starved and locked in darkness, my body wasting away, my mind nearly breaking, and the only thing that kept me alive was the knowledge that God sees everything, that truth buried always rises, that evil hidden always comes to light, and I clawed my way out of that prison with my bare hands, walked for days to get here, hid and planned and waited for this moment, because I wanted you all to see, wanted the cameras to record. wanted the world to witness what this man did to the wife who gave him everything. Someone in the congregation shouted, "Where is the house? Where did he lock you?" And Patience gave the address in Akbra, described the boarded windows and the chains, and immediately several men said they would go verify, would go that very day, and Joshua tried to run, tried to push through the crowd toward the back door, but the congregation surrounded him, held him, and someone called the police while others called journalists, and within 20 minutes the church was swarming with police, officers and reporters and cameras, and Joshua was arrested right there at the altar while his new wife collapsed crying, claiming she knew nothing, claiming he told her Patience had really died in an accident. The police went to Akbra that afternoon with Patience and a crowd of church members and journalists, and they found the house exactly as Patience described, found the chains and padlocks still on the doors, found the hole in the back wall where she had escaped, found the bucket she had used as a toilet, found the evidence of years of imprisonment, and they found the 2 men Joshua had paid, and under questioning the men confessed everything, showed the bank transfers Joshua had made, admitted. They had kept her locked up for over 2 years, and they were arrested immediately for kidnapping and attempted murder. The story exploded across Nigeria. It was on every news channel, every blog, every social media platform. The pastor who buried his wife alive, the woman who rose from the grave to expose him, the empty casket in the church cemetery, and people were outraged. They descended on Divine Mercy Cathedral demanding answers, demanding justice, and the church leadership, the board members who had supported Joshua, claimed they knew nothing, but investigations revealed that some of them had helped him, forged the death certificate, had helped him create the fake accident report, and they were arrested too, charged as accessories. Joshua Emeka was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, fraud, theft, and multiple counts of domestic violence. He was denied bail because the judge said he was a flight risk, and he sat in prison awaiting trial while his empire crumbled. Divine Mercy Cathedral was closed by authorities. The assets were frozen. The mansion was seized, and Sister Blessing, now revealed as an accomplice who knew Patience was alive because one of her text messages to Joshua mentioned, "When will you finish?" Dealing with that village problem, was charged as an accessory and remanded in custody. Patience was hospitalized for 3 months, treated for severe malnutrition, infections, and psychological trauma, and the church members who had genuinely loved her, who had mourned her at the fake funeral, came to visit her, brought food and prayers and tears of joy that she was alive, and they established a fund to support her recovery, and the money poured in from across Nigeria, from people who had heard her story and were moved, and Patience who had lost everything, who had been buried, alive and left to rot, suddenly had more support than she had ever known. The trial took 8 months, and when the verdict came, Joshua Emeka was sentenced to 25 years in prison for attempted murder and kidnapping. The accessory charges added another 10 years, and he would serve 35 years total. And as they led him away in chains, he looked at Patience one last time, and she looked back with eyes that held no forgiveness, no pity, just the cold satisfaction of justice served. And Joshua understood finally that the woman he had tried to bury had instead buried him, and the grave he had dug for her had become his own. Patience rebuilt her life slowly. She reclaimed her father's land through the courts, got back the mansion and sold it, took the money and started a foundation for women escaping domestic violence, called it Second Life Foundation because that's what she had, a second life, a resurrection, and she used her story to help other women recognize the signs of abuse before it was too late. Traveled to churches across Nigeria speaking about her experience, and some churches didn't want to hear it, didn't want to believe a pastor could be so evil, but others listened, others changed their policies, others started training their leaders to spot and stop abuse, and Patience's voice, the voice that had been silenced for 2.5 years, became one of the loudest in Nigeria advocating for women's rights and protection. 3 years after walking into that church service, Patience stood at her father's grave in their village cemetery and told him, "Papa, the land you left me saved my life twice, once by giving me something to dig through to escape, and once by giving me the resources to rebuild. I am still standing, Papa, still fighting, still here, and the man who tried to erase me is erased instead, forgotten except as a warning, while I am remembered as the woman who refused to stay dead." Which moment hit you the hardest? Drop a comment below with your thoughts and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you for watching, and remember, truth buried always rises. Evil hidden always comes to light, and the grave you dig for others might just become your own. See you in the next one.